Well, it's 10:01 Eastern Standard Time in the United States. We will get underway. I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, Sustainability in Growth Impacted Scenarios. This is really a session that's going to help us to challenge the notion of competitiveness and how navigating business in low growth scenarios can be accomplished. Looking at the traditional role of sustainability and how it's evolved over, say, the last 25 years, and moving from what might have been called at one point a marketing-oriented function or an internally focused area of responsibility on employee health, environment, and safety, to what now today is being looked at as part of the strategic framework of the business, and how businesses that incorporate sustainability into its strategic framework can in some ways become more competitive, more resilient, and more risk sensitive to both short, medium, and long-term challenges. So next chart, please, Miriam. Miriam, next chart, please. I today am William Sisson. I will be your host today. I'm the Executive Director of WBCSD North America, and I'm joined by some wonderful people today. Todd Court from Yale will be moderating our session. We have Tim Favory from Maple Leaf Foods, so we'll introduce him in a moment. Susan Beverly from Abbott Labs, and Hervé Dutay from BNP Paribas. Next session, slide, please, Miriam. For those less familiar with the WBCSD, we are business leadership for a sustainable future. Some 200 of the world's global companies come to us around a common vision of creating a world in which over 9 billion people are living well and within the planetary boundaries by 2050. Next slide, please. We're a diverse, multi-sector, multi-business oriented organization. This is a landscape view of all the members of our organization that come together with a common thread of sustainability and how it's becoming more and more integrated into the core functions of the business. Next slide, please. At WBCSD, we focused our work program on 6 key economic system transformations. Circular economy, where we are aspiring for no waste, cities and mobility to be clean and connected, climate and energy, driving towards net zero total emissions of our businesses, food and nature, looking for healthy people and a healthy planet. It's about the people and meeting the basic needs of all, and of course, how we capture value in a much more integrated way when it comes to sustainable capitalism. Next slide, please. We're kicking this virtual event off today with a sequence of events that have happened already in the last week and what will be happening ahead of us. We'll feature 2 sessions per week, each on Monday and Wednesday, right through the end of July. There'll be times so that you can watch them and take part in them anywhere in the world at twice per day. This is about helping to bring more expertise and inspiration and ways in which we can inform and exchange knowledge, not only the WBC community, but the broader business community that wants to take part in these sessions. You can find more about this sequence of events that are ahead of us at the following web address. And you can also navigate to that address at WBCSD's website on wbcsd.org. Next slide, please. The session today, from a housekeeping point of view, is being recorded. All participants are muted. The slides and recording will be made available following the sessions today. We've already had one session today on this topic, and we'll be integrating those two sessions into one accessible website, information source on our website. You can ask questions and probe speakers and context of the session today using your chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just click on chat. You can send a private email to me if you prefer, or you can send a group email to everyone. If you'd also like, in your participants tab, you'll find the place where you can raise your hand and provide other information to let us know you'd like to take part. That is in your participants tab at the bottom of your screen. I'll be moderating the chat function and monitoring the chat function, of course, and providing questions to the panelists and to our moderator to address as we take forward. Next slide, please, Miriam. And again, this is an antitrust reminder statement that we need to avoid any discussion in any conversation, including on our chat, of competitively sensitive topics, pricing, bids, future capacity additions, customers, or output decisions. Next slide, please, Miriam. Our agenda today will look into the business competitiveness and global challenges. We'll then move quickly into a discussion on leveraging sustainability to long-term competitiveness. We'll have an open debate and question and answer session with our panelists, moderated by Todd Court from Yale, who is quite familiar with these topics. And then we'll wrap up with a closing remarks. Throughout this agenda, we will be probing our attendees using a Mentimeter data collection that will require you to have access to your mobile device, and we'll give you more information on that when we get there. Next slide, please, Miriam. Just to set a bit of context, at the WBCSD, we've been looking very carefully at 31 of our members who are traded on the New York Stock Exchange, at how they've weathered the current downturn in this current economic low growth scenario. Not surprisingly, the WBCSD portfolio, as we call it, has been consistently outperforming and beating the market by about 10% year to date. It suggests, perhaps as a data point for discussion, how companies that are practicing and embedding sustainability into their functional role of the organization are actually better equipped to manage through some of these economic challenging times. They're better equipped per se in terms of resilience, in terms of business strategy, in terms of understanding the necessary ways in which to practice and look ahead at risk. The next slide, please, Miriam. And it's not just in the short term, but also in the long term. And so if you look out over this is as a chart looking at the European members and suggesting a very similar sort of outcome in terms of how the markets have performed under these current economically challenging conditions. So both in the US and in European stock markets, we're seeing a suggestion that ESG-driven companies have a better chance of economically outperforming their peers in these times of challenging growth. And we're going to explore this a bit with our panelists and moderator to get a better perspective on how a few of our companies are looking at at their own internal strategies and how they are better equipping themselves under current situations like we're dealing with today, and how they manage their companies going forward. Next slide, please, Miriam. So we're going to start out, before we turn it over to the panelists and our moderator, we're going to start out with our first Mentimeter question. This instruction set should give you some guidance that you need, so please grab your phone or other mobile device that you would typically use. Go to www.menti.com. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And then enter the code that comes up when you are at the website. It should prompt you for that code. You can enter the code 374319. So one area we'd like to probe first is just to get kind of a foundation set from all the participants on the call today to answer a basic question: what is the most crucial area in which your sustainability function adds value to your business? So if you could take a few minutes, or a few seconds, I should say, at the outset of this session to give us your response, we'd really appreciate understanding how you see the sustainability function in your business. So please, yes, good. We have one response. Let's get a few more. Seems like resource efficiency, risk management are certainly rising to the top, but not to bias your answers in any way. We'll just give it a few more seconds. You can continue to plug in your answers and it will update before we move on to the next question. So if you're having any issues and you finally are able to get through to www.menti.com, enter that code, and then you can put your answers in, and we'll have this finalized in the final deck that we publish later in the day. Great. So risk management, resource efficiency are clearly driving to the top, with some degree of reputation and stakeholder engagement as important in the role. There's probably other answers out there, and we understand that, but do your best to at least give us a sense in this condition. Okay, Miriam, let's move on and get started with the rest of the session. Today's moderator is Todd Court from Yale University in the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. He's a lecturer and faculty co-director. Todd, it's wonderful to have you with us today. I'm looking forward to a really exciting and creative discussion on this very topic of sustainability in low growth scenarios and how business is adapting and perhaps even rethinking in the current condition how they're approaching sustainability from a business strategic framework point of view. So Todd, please take it away. Over to you.
All right, you can hear me okay? Thumbs up or something? Great. All right, welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Bill said, we've got a fantastic group of speakers today who I'll introduce shortly. I just want to frame this conversation a little bit with some of the information and research that are coming out of universities today, including Yale. As we've seen the downturn and kind of this corporate resilience strategy over the last couple of months, there have been several focus areas that research has gone to try and assess how will we come out of this, like what will growth look like in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, and a few elements have come up. One has been kind of what is the nature of business risk planning and resilience? How will businesses change or adapt the way that they assess risks, particularly exogenous risks? and how those will be built into your strategic planning. A second has been around more aggressive pricing of these externalities. And we're very fortunate to have a representative from the financial industry today to speak to that. And a third has been around the role of government going forward. We all know that governments are putting a lot of cash into the economy today, and they're going to have a greater hand on the tiller of the economy going forward to dictate and incentivize markets to grow in some areas and others, and not others. So there's a lot of questions circling as to kind of not only how businesses have been more or less resilient over the last 2 months, but how those lessons are going to be applied going forward in the face of these kind of new mega trends that we're looking at. So my order of play here is I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers briefly, and then I'm going to hand over the reins to each of them in turn. So I'll hand over to Susan, and then Tim, and then Hervé. But just as a brief introduction to these 3, so first we have Susan Beverly. Susan is the Senior Director of Sustainability and Shared Impact at Abbott. She is a member of the leadership team that launched Abbott's Shared Value Strategy, a core tenet of Abbott's approach to business development in new and emerging markets. Susan is also responsible for Abbott's global sustainability reporting, sustainability materiality tied to enterprise risk management, and stakeholder engagement. So it's wonderful to have Abbott here and Susan representing, because Abbott obviously sits right on the forefront of healthcare and in the midst of this current crisis, and is going to be an important speaker on resilience in that context. Next, we have Tim Faveri. Tim is the Vice President of Sustainability and Shared Value at Maple Leaf Foods. Tim leads the execution of the strategy and initiatives at Maple Leaf that embed sustainability into their culture and business. Prior to joining Maple Leaf Foods, Tim was accountable for sustainability strategy and development and execution for Tim Hortons. Those of you who live in North America will be very familiar with Tim Hortons as a source of donuts, among other things. And then finally, we have Hervé Duté of BNP Paribas. Hervé is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Americas at BNP. In that role, he leads the bank's regional strategy for corporate social responsibility, sustainable finance, and company engagement. And in 2018, he was selected by Euromoney as one of the 10 champions of global impact banking. And I can't help just adding a little bit extra about Hervé. In addition to his various distinguished degrees, he is also a professional concert musician and has various certificates from the Juilliard School of Music in New York. So an incredibly accomplished panel today, representing 3 sectors that are so important to the current crisis and to how we're going to grow out of this crisis. So Susan, let me hand over to you if you want to share your screen and introduce Abbott and your strategy.
Sounds good, thank you. Okay, all right. Just gonna get this into presentation mode. Okay, thank you, Todd. So just very quickly, so I'm Susan Beverly, Senior Director of Sustainability, Shared Impact at Abbott. As Todd said, I've been with the company for over 15 years in a variety of roles. And right now I'm looking after our sustainability strategy and also our shared value strategy, which go hand in hand. So working with our businesses, all 6 of them, to think through new models to compete, to innovate as we think about our growth and our long-term value creation. So a little bit of background about Abbott. We've been around for 130 years, 107,000 people around the world. We have a number of products that you may be familiar with, our nutrition business, Similac and Pedialyte, with our diabetes business, Freestyle Libre, which you may have heard of, and also ID Now, which that's one of our responses to the current COVID crisis. When you look across our portfolio, our approach is looking to deliver innovative solutions for every healthcare stage of life. So whether that's our cardiovascular business, there are a number of stents and other health, cardiovascular solutions that we are innovating in order to save lives and help extend lives. Diabetes, diagnostics, which I'll get into a bit more about the COVID response later during our Q&A. And then also neuromodulation, nutrition, and then we also have a branded generics medicines business. So very diversified, which I think makes it quite interesting to deliver on both sustainability and shared value, because the issues are not always the same. And so we have very interesting conversations internally about that trade-off and prioritization and where we can deliver the most value to our stakeholders across our portfolio. When it comes to sustainability, it really is our business strategy. So we've obviously been doing this work for a while, started off as citizenship, moved to strategic sustainability, and then we added on shared value. But as we've talked about this with our executive team over the last year, Abbott's in the process of creating our 2030 sustainability strategy. It really is an extension of our organic execution model. So thinking about across that portfolio, what are our risks, what are the opportunities, and how do we design business strategies in order to deliver on that over the long term? So like most of you on the line, most companies, we conducted a materiality analysis, working very closely though with enterprise risk management. And I think that I can talk about that more during the Q&A, but that's been a very interesting and I think productive process for us that runs all the way up to our board of directors, where we were able to identify our 19 enterprise risks and then kind of look at our 17 ESG material topics and then prioritize these 6, which are the foundation of the work that we do. And I think based on the conversation today, innovation and supply chain really emerged to the fore as you think about long-term value creation, planning for disruption in this time. So that's just a little bit about our company. I'll turn it back to you, Todd.
Brilliant, thank you. So before I hand over to Tim, and Tim, you can go ahead and share your screen when you're ready. I just want to remind people, you can go ahead and put questions into the chat now for our speakers, or you can also raise your hands and we'll collect those questions for after our introductions. So Tim?
Thanks so much, and pleased to be here with everyone and sharing the stage with some distinguished speakers. Can't say that I would have the resume of Hervé, but nonetheless, lots of years experience on sustainability. As Susan did, I'll share a little bit about our Maple Leaf Foods journey and how we've been executing on sustainability. I've been with the company just about 5 years now, approaching 5 years. And Maple Leaf Foods, Maple Leaf Foods is one of Canada's largest food companies. Our value chain, our supply chain is quite complex because we are farm to fork. We're farm to fork on the pork side of our business. Poultry is a little bit managed a little bit differently in Canada. We actually hatch chicks in 3 different hatcheries, sell those chicks to independent growers, and then buy back those same birds when they're at market weight and then put them into our supply chain. That's a system called supply management in Canada, and it's quite unique on the commodity side. So barns and hatcheries, so we do have animals in our care. We have a select small fleet that transports animals between our barns and to processing facilities. We have about 30 processing facilities across Canada, 2 in the United States. That is on the plant-based protein side of our business. We primarily use third-party haulers to distribute to our customers, and our customers include pretty much all of the big grocery retailers, food service organizations, restaurants, universities, etc. And we're part of that food supply chain, obviously, that has been deemed essential during this pandemic. Overall, Maple Leaf has about 13,000 employees across our enterprise. When I joined the company, we had just finished a major transformation, or just completing a major transformation, a transformation from fixing the business from a listeriosis crisis the company experienced in 2008 to growing the business. And then actually in 2014, the company sold an international bread business, a pasta business, a rendering business, and came back to core meat protein as the foundation of the company. And over the next few years, I was privileged to be part of the growth strategy, and that involved redefining how we were going to grow, and particularly that being setting a purpose for the. We were doing CSR, we were doing sustainability. This opportunity for us, as we identified lots of challenges in the food system, and anyone that works in the industry knows them quite well. There were numerous disconnects that we saw in our strategy development process. Almost 1 billion people on the planet are undernourished, yet 2 billion people are overweight, and we waste 1/3 of our food. The food system has significant issues, or have had significant issues in transparency. Climate change is impacting food systems in a huge way. And those companies that have animals in our supply chain are always challenged with various levels of animal care and standards across our operations. So we needed a strategy and set a pathway forward for us to make a difference. And that's purpose. And for the years I've been doing sustainability, I think this is the next phase for corporate social responsibility. It defines what's unique, authentic to our companies. You essentially go through why your company exists, and you identify what the world needs and what society needs that you can have an impact. Our purpose is called Raise the Good in Food. Raise is an action-oriented word for us. It means to lift, to elevate, to continuously improve. Good food, obviously, is sustainably sourced food, nutritious, focusing on food insecurity and some of those other social issues that we're working on. For us to make that purpose stick, we didn't want Raise the Good in Food just to be another corporate slogan. We needed a business strategy that, as Susan described, shared value. Abbott, it's similar. For a food company, obviously, we've got products and we have to focus on reconfiguring those products or markets that we enter to address social and environmental issues. So when you think of what purpose, how purpose is defined and what shared value defines, this is a disruptor strategy. It's a business strategy. It differentiates us against our competitors to deliver competitiveness and growth, while at the same time focusing on social and environmental issues. It just resonated with our senior leadership team as a business strategy for us to adopt. How we did that, we created a blueprint. We've been using this for a few years now. This is pretty much our business strategy. Our purpose is Raise the Good in Foods. Our vision, we believe that we need a guiding light, a North Star, for example, and our vision to be the most sustainable protein company on earth is something that we always strive for, because things we're focusing on now might not even be considered sustainable in the next few years. We're aligned on sustainability around 4 pillars: better food, better planet, better care, and better communities for where we operate. And then we have 6 core business strategies, and this is how we create shared value for our organization. If you double-clicked on any one of these core business strategies, you would find numerous priorities, each with senior leadership team accountability, KPIs that we have to report to our COO and our CFO on a monthly basis, driving the business. Part of the big pivot that Maple Leaf has had in terms of overall protein is the strategy that we've embraced around protein alternatives. And this is a big part of how we felt our company has maintained resiliency and growth. Plant protein for us, now we're one of the largest plant protein companies in North America through strategic acquisition, and big hopes on plant protein. Obviously, we've come out and communicated that we think it's going to be equal in revenue to our meat protein side of the business within 10 years. So basically doubling the size of our business. So very important, this strategy on a page sits on everyone's desk. We talk to it at every meeting. It is the basis of how we do business and how we've integrated sustainability. Lastly, as part of the journey, in November of last year, we announced some pretty big environmental goals. Part of my responsibility under our blueprint, we have became the first carbon neutral food company in the world. And this is interesting because part of our announcements and our communication really gave us the opportunity to more meaningfully connect with a lot of our stakeholders. One being some of our lenders. So we, in December, became the first company combined with the BMO Capital Markets Group to enter into a sustainability-linked loan. We amended some existing credit facilities that we had to include environmental performance for reduced interest rate. At the same time, earlier in 2020, Corporate Knights, which is a leading magazine around clean capitalism, in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, did an index around the top businesses that helped shape the planet over the last 50 years, and we were named to that list, so we were very proud of that. We work with our customers, so Project Gigaton, Walmart's big supply chain program. Likely if it was not for our purpose and our performance, we got the opportunity, very, very honored to participate in their annual milestone supplier meeting. Our CEO took the stage with the Canadian CEO and was simulcast globally, sharing our story. Because we have animals in our care and emerging investor benchmarks and indices, we've done a good job at transparency and our standards, and are consistently highly ranked on 2 key animal welfare indices. And as well, because we're purposeful, our acquisition of Field Roast Grain Meat Company and Light Life Foods that form Greenleaf Foods, our plant-based subsidiary, likely wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had such a focus on sustainability and growth projections around sustainability. For the investors and those that follow markets, I don't know if I can take full credit or our program can take full credit for it, but when we announced and in November we saw a very good growth with respect to our share price. You can see what happened in COVID, obviously a big drop, but we're back now on that growth projection curve in our purpose, and that's how Raise the Good in Food, we believe, is creating significant business value. I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Sorry, you broke up right at the end there. I didn't mean to interrupt. All right, so finally, I want to bring Hervé on. Hervé, if you could give a brief introduction, and then we have a Mentimeter question, then we'll go straight into questions. You're muted, Hervé.
Good morning, everyone. Apologies. Thank you, Todd. I would like to invite you to a reflection on COVID-19 and finance and banking. Rather than speak to you directly about what we do, as I think you know pretty much what banks do. We banks do not create much, if anything, directly, actually. But we earn money. And if we earn money, it's because we're selling something, and that something is time, along with the risks that it carries. if you think about it, when we do a mortgage, it is the sale of time. If I lend you $1 million and take it back instantly, I shall not charge you anything. Lawyers might to draft the contract, but banks should not. However, if I lend you $1 million overnight, then we will start charging you something, and even more so for 30 years. Interestingly, the COVID-19 pandemic crisis is teaching us something about time, especially as it gives us glimpses into what the future holds. So I'd like to look and examine 3 visions into the future that we're seeing in this pandemic, and then reflect on the future that we would like to finance. So the first vision into the future that COVID-19 is offering us, it's the most basic one, but that is that we are facing a common long-term goal. All of a sudden, we are refocused on the long term. We acknowledge that we prefer a healthy future, and we are ready to tremendous sacrifices to preserve that future. The second vision is into the future. It's actually into a future that we do not want. And as the world is understanding better these days the linkages between pandemics and climate change and biodiversity erosion, the world also understands better what pandemics are about. Yes, it is about health scare. Yes, it is about some mortality rates. But it's first and foremost, for the majority of us, it's about a deep economic recession filled with bankruptcies, with skyrocketing unemployment, and even the loss of some individual freedoms. And so we are learning to listen to science. And we also learn that science is not perfect truth, and that it does not replace bold decisions in a world that is still not perfectly predictable. The third and more interesting vision for us is that this pandemic gives us a vision into a decarbonized world, and especially what an abrupt or disorderly decarbonization pathway may be about. We are living things that were inconceivable 2 or 3 months ago. Virtually all planes are grounded. Oil prices have traded negative, and we are seeing tumbling oil and gas stock prices when it is an industry maybe that wanted to believe that it could go on and on an uninterrupted growth decades on. We know that the fossil fuel sector has been under long-term structural pressure, but maybe some of the behavioral changes that we're seeing during this pandemic will stick, and this crisis may have accelerated what we call peak demand for oil and gas. What is sure is that an abrupt or disorderly decarbonization is very disruptive. And we have ways to make it orderly. We have ways for oil and gas companies to remain, but not to remain the way we know them today, but to become probably more energy companies. So I'm going to revisit those 3 visions and illustrate them into the banking sector. And actually, we haven't waited for the coronavirus crisis to make those realizations. So first, back to the first vision of the future, which was we are facing a long-term common goal. I can share you a short story at BNP Paribas in the investment banking division, which is not the retail division and not the asset management division, but it's the division that does loans, bonds, swaps, where we're really dealing with esoteric products. A small number of us initially 6 years ago starting to rise and wonder how we could transform those products to create a positive impact for the planet. This has blossomed into more than 500 or 600 people today in the investment banking division alone, being plugged on those topics. And it actually was probably one of the forces behind the BNP Paribas internal manifesto back in 2018 and our external statement of purpose that we published in 2019. So revisiting the purpose of a bank for society. The second vision about what we do not want, if you recall, it's basically that we must listen to science if we want to avoid pandemics. And we know that climate change and biodiversity loss are accelerating the risk of pandemics. And so we've been one of the few banks to really take some really bold decisions. In 2017, we decided to exit from businesses that were primarily involved with shale oil and gas, from exploration, production, transportation, marketing, or trading. I think to date, we're the only bank to have gone that far. Last year, we've also put a clear exit to a clear timeline for the exit from financing power utilities that are still involved in coal. For long, we are no longer financing single projects, but basically we've said by 2030, we'll be out of financing any company that may still have one single coal power asset in Europe, and by 2040, one single power coal asset around the world. As well, we did publish in 2019, during last year, during Climate Week, a position statement on the oceans. I think we're also one of the very early banks to create policies that tackle with diversity. Now, last and most interesting is the third vision into the future, which is about decarbonization. And what we've been really crafting over the last 6 years is what we call sustainable finance. Sustainable finance, let's be clear, does not finance anything that conventional finance could not finance. The genius of sustainable finance is elsewhere, and it's having created a race to the top. In sustainable finance, you know, if you think of green bond, gender bond, blue bonds, pandemic bonds, vaccine bonds, and so on, we are creating labels. And if we've also created mechanisms where we link the interest rate to sustainability performance. And Maple Leaf mentioned the sustainability linked loan that they did with BMO, where the rate moves up or down with the achievements of some targets. Well, what we've done is create a divide among borrowers and create also a divide among investors. All of a sudden, we have a measure between green, transition, and brown. We have a measure to distinguish between dark green and light green, between green and greener, between greener and greenest. And guess what? Human greed that has been to some extent at the source of our problems is now competing for green. And basically we are restoring this invisible hand where companies now are competing against each other to do good and look good thanks to financial product. So I will conclude here that as banks, as investors, we can give a price in the present to the unsustainable future that the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, for example, is recalling to our mind, so that we can shape the sustainable future that we want. And pricing future unsustainability into the present, that's what we call sustainable finance.
All right. Great, thank you, Hervé. So before we dive into questions, and I've already have a bunch on my paper, I want to go back to our audience. We have a second Mentimeter question for you. So remember the instructions, hopefully you already have it up on your phone. Go to menti.com, type in the code, and here is our question: whether has this current low growth situation impacted or changed you or your company's sustainability role? Number of no's so far. See if we have any final bits. So while these are filling in, Susan, I think I want to go to you first. So I had this question. I think JP in the chat has really reflected it well. My question was, you know, what we've seen over the last couple of months. Have you at Abbott kind of learned any lessons from you know, what has occurred in and around the company over the last couple of months? And is this, you know, changing, or are there any? Are you taking any of these lessons forward? Is there anything that you think that you want to evolve or adapt or change looking forward, either in the short term or in the long term, with these kinds of risks accelerating?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And I feel like the response is a bit twofold. So we had our earnings call last week, I believe, and our CEO, Robert Ford, said, you know, we've been planning for this kind of disruption in healthcare for a while. And so I don't think that you're, you know, a successful and kind of long-standing healthcare company without thinking about disruption. Of course, we didn't know something like this would come, but I think what has changed is really looking at operations and supply chain and figuring out how to manage that over the long term. So I think the good news is the numbers of tests that we're able to produce every month and kind of moving forward, it's pretty massive, right? And that wasn't a light switch. And so that's something that the company had been planning for quite some time. I think as we move forward and look across the entire portfolio, because right now it's just impacting diagnostics, but we have this diversified business portfolio, we're looking at some of the other issues around innovation and access. And I mentioned earlier, we have our 2030 sustainability strategy underway. And it was somewhat, I think, kind of locked and loaded. And then COVID hit, right? And so now we're starting to think about the issues that, if you just kind of take the US health system and the ecosystem and some of those cracks and kind of what is our role. I think there's diagnostics testing, but you can produce products and services, but you have to really think about that entire ecosystem. So thinking about, you know, telemedicine and remote, not only just remote care, but delivering our products in some sort of innovative and remote fashion. So a lot of, I think our material issues have not changed. And that's the good news, because they're rooted in who we are. That ERM, ESG alignment actually proved to work quite well. The opportunity moving forward is digging in and thinking about how are we going to adjust and make sure that for the next 10 years, we're ready for, you know, the next crisis so that we can provide the right response.
Tim, have you found the same thing, that kind of your material issues have not changed so much, but the way that you might approach them or stress test them might be different in the future?
Yeah, I would agree with Susan as well. I think as a food manufacturer, as being in the food industry, there's a certain amount of resilience built in. Not to say that it could be much more efficient or more robust, but we're always looking at risk and opportunity. As a company in Canada, we were fortunately well prepared. We've had an active and emergency management council in the company for many years, and that really comes from you know, the impacts of SARS back in 2002. Our food safety crisis in 2008, and then a whole very big effort, proactive effort on African swine fever that our company and the entire industry in Canada has been looking at. So, you know, opportunities when we think of consumers and our retail customers and our food service customers, you know, you have to use the word normal with air quotes right across the board. We don't know what this is going to look like. I think we're getting a sense as companies start to open, or countries start to open up. But you know, some of the opportunities that we're seeing in the business is a movement to other sales channels like e-commerce and direct delivery to consumers instead of going through other channels. So we always take an opportunities lens with anything that hits our business, and I think that's what kind of drives stability and resilience forward. Digital is another one that we've had a strategy on for many years, and thank goodness we did, because we were able to adapt very quickly in terms of working from home and other aspects of our digital platform.
So, Hervé, before I turn to the question from Messia in the chat, I wanted to ask you about kind of the pricing of these externalities. So, you know, you mentioned sustainable finance, and sustainable finance creates these incentives to, you know, as a race to the top. And one of the ways it presumably has done that is to put a price on externalities for companies. Does that change looking forward? Is there a way that finance can you know, look at pandemics, climate change, chronic water stress, et cetera, and come up with more intelligent pricing strategies to help incentivize companies?
So can it change? Yes, it can change. I think what the COVID-19 crisis will do for us, and because I think right now we are in the eye of the storms. The companies we finance are first and foremost focused on maintaining their liquidity, and they're not thinking about financing other projects or adding bells and whistles to the current financings right now. But I think this crisis will help in internalizing what we've been saying for years, that the world is simply unsustainable. And when we say unsustainable, it's not about solely polar bears disappearing or whatever, but it's about socioeconomic harm, or even for our health. But I think people are the vast majority of people are impacted by socioeconomic issues. So it will help us drive the point. Now, as I hinted earlier, the markets are not functioning when it comes to sustainability because public policy has not leveled the playing field. And as you said, negative externalities are not priced in. So what we can do as banks, it's two things. First, trying to be the good student and indeed reflect that financing an unsustainable business will ultimately be more costly for our portfolios than sustainable ones. But realize, and you all know that in each of your industries, whether it's pharma or food, etc., when you start raising the price, you start losing business. So we do that in a variety of ways to convey that there is a higher cost for us to finance less sustainable companies. The other is to create this emulation, this race to the top, where the companies we finance partner with us precisely to accelerate raising the bar.
So we have a question in the chat, and it's for all the panelists. And the question is whether any of you are aware or see organizations that are rethinking their existing sustainability strategies or business strategies to ascertain if they'll still make sense in the post-COVID, hopefully, growth or world.
I can start answering to that. One is the oil and gas industry. And in fact, in the last week or two, you might have seen declarations from CEOs, in particular, I recall from BP and Shell, which is really hinting at the fact that it's not necessarily a discovery, but that this crisis is certainly accelerating the thinking of the fragility of our world. So I'll stop here, let others share. But that's from my vantage point. I can see that a greater open ear publicly to accelerate this transition towards an energy model from an exploration model.
Susan or Tim, maybe from the healthcare or food perspective, are you seeing any shifts in strategy to help post-COVID?
I can start. I think for healthcare, I feel like it's more of like pressure testing the strategy, but not a complete shift because, you know, again, if you're in healthcare, like your strategy is, you know, how you're delivering business. So I think we need to think a bit outside of the box and bring in some of the issues like access and affordability, you know, more intentionally in order to really thrive. But one sector, not mine, that popped into my head was retail. And I've been in a few conversations. I'll be very interested to see how the retail sector responds to this, because I think that they were very much ahead in sustainability, thinking about supply chain. And I'm curious after the dust settles, kind of what that looks like and if that is in fact the most important issue.
Tim?
I think Susan summarized that very well. It's a pressure testing, and I think because of how sustainability programming is kind of baked into both organizations through you know, robust stakeholder engagement and materiality assessments, that it's pressure testing those key priorities. You know, from our perspective, and from my perspective, we're also thinking ahead here in how we can mitigate any impacts on the sustainability strategy once the economy starts to pick up again. So I think we can all agree that Mother Earth is breathing a little bit easier right now with respect to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. But if we think about the last economic downturn, in the recovery period, emissions jumped up quite significantly. So we're looking at how it could potentially impact our overall GHG emissions and see how we can benefit from analyzing the data and seeing if we can maintain lower environmental impact on the overall business. And we've already started somewhat of a return to work strategy that builds sustainability measures right into it.
If I may add one more sector, Todd, I wonder also what it will do to commercial real estate across companies as we rethink the way we come to work or stay at home, as this pandemic has forced us on a crash course to learn new ways of functioning, and from possible productivity gains, academic will tell us, to cost savings, to convenience for others. I really wonder how this will transform both the way we work and the commercial real estate business.
Yeah, at least two of you have mentioned supply chain. There's an interesting article in either the FT or the Economist a week or so ago that was looking at, sort of asking this question about resilience of supply chains, and is framing it in a macroeconomic lens, saying, as we come out of this, you know, will finance or businesses look at supply chains and say, we need more resilient, more diverse, but less efficient supply chains going forward? Or will we revert to the model where we've been going for decades now, which is streamlined, efficient supply chains are the solution to profitability? I think this is particularly relevant for Abbott and for Maple Leaf. Is there a thinking or a shift in the way you see supply chains becoming more resilient in the future?
Do you want me to go first, Susan?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I can take that. Todd, it actually is a really interesting point that you've raised. In agriculture in particular, the feed industry and agriculture has embraced technology and more efficient agricultural inputs. And from a resiliency perspective, we look at a farm to fork company like we are, a lot of our supply chain is within our control, particularly with the production of our food products. However, the vast majority of the impact is still somewhat out of our control because it relates to the feed or the commodities that we source. What is a really interesting aspect that you brought up is kind of a back to the future way of thinking, particularly where these impacts exist. So, there's a lot of talk right now in the industry about regenerative agriculture, sequestering carbon in soils. And, I put it out to the industry, is it regenerative agriculture, or is it just the way, we used to farm 3-4 generations ago? Organic fertilizer, cover crops, no-till farming, these kinds of things are back in the day were just considered good agricultural practices, yet the pendulum swung fairly far in one direction for efficiency. I personally think it has to be a balance back towards more sustainable practices.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think, Taji said more diverse supply chains. And I think that is the case in healthcare. So we had been kind of thinking about on-demand strategies, that this traditional model, I think the traditional model works really well and it's working well in this pandemic, right? But after this, what kind of supply chain models and strategies will be needed in order to meet not only customer needs, but also, I think, government. So there's this level of government oversight and engagement in thinking about what's needed at a country level. So I know right now I think both models are thriving a bit, but I would say moving forward in healthcare, thinking more outside of the box, more diverse and tailored is what's to come. And
I wanted to ask one more really tactical question before I go to Janita's question in the chat. This really tactical question is, so all of these companies and BNP does this as well for its clients. We're all looking at enterprise risk management, criteria for assessing risk. We're all looking at material sustainability issues as part of that enterprise risk management assessment. But this pandemic has been a real test for the way that we look at low probability, incredibly high magnitude impacts. And how do we price that into, or how do we integrate that into an enterprise risk management approach? Like, how do you compare that low probability event? Because the way that we've done it in the past in enterprise risk management is we say, well, low probability event of high magnitude, we have a mitigation strategy of diversification of our supply chain, or we can shift production to a new location. Right? We address it through diversification type resilience strategies, but this pandemic has shown that doesn't work, at least for this one. And there are some risks on the horizon that might be of similar nature, like chronic water shortages that hit many regions at the same time, like severe weather frequency that hits logistics chains around the world, like a pandemic that hits human resources across the world. The way that you are looking at your enterprise risk management for these types of low probability, high magnitude risks and the response that you would take against those, sustainability has such a core, role in that question. I wonder if is that going? Do you see any change in the way that you undertake your risk assessment and risk mitigation strategies in the face of these kinds of risks looking forward? And it's a very complicated question, but seems like an important one.
I can start from the finance sector. The reality is that on the finance sector, we are dependent upon we don't have a supply chain as per se. We are dependent upon the people who borrow from us. And The financial sector has been sensitive to risk for decades, as you know, and this notion of green swan, that is very low probability, high magnitude events that can happen due to sustainability, we've been sensitive for quite a number of years. And the reality is such a risk we cannot mitigate. We cannot hedge because it's not what we call diversifiable. Regular portfolio risk that we have, if you're exposed to company X, is you buy the world, you buy company Z, A, B, C, and D, and you diversify your risk. Here it's systemic. Here it's global. There's no hedge against this, but there is one strategy, and it's a strategy that we push forward, we advocate forward, and that's some large investors are doing, and it's called engagement. If you think of a BlackRock that has close to $7 trillion of assets under management, there's no way they can hedge their portfolio to any systemic risk, be it a pandemic or be it whatever you want to call it. There's not enough gold in the world or whatever that they can buy in their portfolio, you know, or so-called doomsday assets like defense stock or whatever to hedge the risk. But what they can do is engage the companies they invest in, and the same way we do engage the company we lend money to. And basically what they telling them, save the planet to save our portfolios, basically.
Susan or Tim, do you want to add anything?
What is going to happen in most companies is post-COVID, or as we start easing in restrictions and opening it up, and hopefully companies take time to do this, because if you don't and just want to get back to business, you're going to lose these opportunities that, you know, Susan and I have been talking about with respect to a post-COVID world, because we know that there's going to be a different COVID moving forward as well. But to take the time to analyze and assess these impacts and the risks and potential opportunities that it would play on your business. You know, those, as you described, Todd, low probability, high negative impacts. You know, organizations that embrace this kind of approach have a heat map, right? And that heat map likely needs to be refreshed, and perhaps definitions of inherent and emerging risk to their organization, but based on the experience and the data and the learnings from what how we've responded for this crisis and potential crises that we've already experienced or are going to be experienced moving forward.
Yeah, and maybe just one last very quick point. I think this is where ESG materiality can help, because I think we can disrupt that very kind of regimented, at least at Abbott, model thinking about risk management. You know, there's a filter, the financials, if you look through it, kind of what passes as very high risk, medium, low. By aligning the two processes, we've been able to have a different kind of conversation and allow the organization to look a bit, to take that long view and have it actually matter. So I think we could see it as an opportunity to maybe just even rethink that alignment. If we're all doing it, perhaps we need to do it a bit differently.
Yeah, I think at a very basic level, enterprise risk management, it involves asking people within the company what risks they see as material. So at a very basic level, this has to get the people we ask within the company to start thinking about these risks a little bit more. So maybe they'll just inherently ping more on these risk registers. It's a good segue to Juanita's question in the chat, which is it's a very tangible operational question. As our companies emerge from this, you know, you either kind of try to go back to, you know, business as usual in terms of people coming into the office and we're working in teams and meetings again, et cetera, or you're going into a new normal of operations where there's some integration of online, for example. But her question is around, have your companies looked out over the next several months, maybe 6 months or so, to either deal with the awkwardness of business as usual, or to start to plan for new habits that you would apply in the based on where we are now?
Well, I'd say at Abbott, it's an ongoing discussion about kind of what the new normal is. There is a recognition and directive from our CEO that, there is no going back to what was, and that's actually a good thing, because it's going to allow us to rethink and engage with our stakeholders and respond to consumers and customers in a different way. But I think that talent piece is very interesting to me, because I feel like right now we're all thinking of, getting back to work, but eventually when the tide turns or shifts a bit, I do think that talent is going to require more, want different things, and companies that are thinking about those innovative strategies to then kind of recruit and retain will be interesting. So I know our HR team is thinking through a number of scenarios, not only for kind of getting current employees back to work, but thinking about what does the future workforce look like? What do we need also as we move forward post-pandemic?
Yeah, I would agree. Human beings are creatures of habit, right? And the longer COVID restrictions play out, habits are going to be built by ordering their food online and not going to retail to pick it up, or restaurants. And as it opens up, what kind of restrictions are there going to be on that? And so for food companies, the opportunity rests with how to adapt, right? And that kind of return to work program or strategy that hopefully all companies are looking at.
I know I'm not a panelist, but the university perspective is relevant here, because there is inherent value at a university of students coming together in person, and we're grappling with this. As I think a lot of headlines will speak to. How do we deliver the same amount of value in a hybrid online world? And will students give us a backlash in terms of tuition and even enrollment? So we've got about 5 minutes or so. If we have any final questions from the audience, I want to steer steer this back to Hervé, because we've been talking about operations a little bit. When we're looking at kind of loans and the cost of capital for businesses going forward, are there any lessons that you would point to, Hervé, for businesses in the next year or two to suggest how they might make themselves more attractive, if you will, and reduce their own cost of capital for banks in the future?
Yes. So it's attraction is part of it, but it's not the primary driver. I think the whole idea is to we're really the reality, as we know, is not embarking on ambitious sustainable plan is a risk for all, but certainly for investors and us lenders. Now, this risk is not yet pervasively acknowledged, except in academic circles and audiences like this. And we really need to make this push that people internalize that unmanaged sustainability issues are a real financial risk. We used to call that extra financial risk, but no, they are financial risk. So we have devised a number of that are recognizing that by linking the interest.
Oh, I think Hervé's connection might be going. Or is it just me?
Or the
Hervé, it may be better for you if you turned your video off. You're breaking up audio on us.
Material.
No, I think its connection might be gone. So let me I'm going to step in because we can't hear you, Hervé. I have one final question for Susan and Tim, which is around the topic that we started with, but we haven't followed up on, which is government policy. You're both global companies in terms of your value chain. Have you seen signs from governments that there will be incentives toward particular areas of growth going forward? Like the green economy, for example, as a trigger for growth, or more focus on equality and high-speed internet connection, for example. Are you seeing any signs from government policy in terms of where you might see opportunities for your strategy?
We have in Canada. The government has announced a number of different incentive and funding packages as part of the pandemic and the federal response. And then we're also seeing it down at the provincial level as well. So we're looking at those very closely. Some of the risks here is some jurisdictions are lessening environmental requirements and laws that to recover, to make it easier for organizations to recover, and that's going to be a challenge for certain industries, I think, and for broader society with respect to environmental impact. But I think government is doing a good job overall, certainly where we operate. But there's also challenges once we do get back to a new normal in terms of polarization that's happening globally with respect to politics and how that influences decision making and standards, because with governments potentially changing and bringing whole new policies in every 4 years, or when governments fall or get reelected, we need as organizations consistency, stability with respect to those. So yes, I think everyone's looking at it. Let's get through this, but then how can we maintain that?
Hervé, I'm sorry you cut out on us there, but the question was around government policy and whether you're seeing any trends or shifts in government incentives in the future.
I'm part of the CFTC some market risk committee, for example, and I do see, as you know, there's a lot of regulations all around the world, especially in Europe, and I do see real sign of movements in the US and Canada, actually. As to the question whether we'll get the Green Deal or not at the time where we have all those reflation stimulus packages, they're being talked. I'm not necessarily highly optimistic. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of that, but it's very well possible that despite all the new realizations we've come through this crisis, priorities may go to emergency and economic measures than the long-term planning.
So Susan, let me give the last word to you. Whether you're, if it's on government policy or any other topic you want to leave us with.
I agree with Tim and Hervé. I think that it's definitely being looked at. I think from a healthcare perspective, we're more in crisis mode right now. But I think Hervé's last point, are we going to then funnel all of our energy into the next crisis or actually planning for the long term? And I hope the latter. I think we were very, just as a society, ill-equipped for what's taking place. And, you think about education, not to get into a different topic, right? These are there. We kind of pick up and think about a longer term approach moving forward, which will benefit not only our businesses, but society overall.
And if I could add just one more word, Todd, we've talked about risks, and this pandemic is certainly having us realize the magnitude of risks ahead. It will help us mitigate them and price them. But I have one worry, and there is one risk I wish we will embrace, and it's the risk of human interactions.
I've never heard it called a risk before, human interaction.
No, but when you think about it, we're going to find ourselves in the office on the return to work wearing masks, where we will get in a meeting, you will have less facial cues that we do have currently on Zoom. This is very puzzling.
It is very puzzling. All right, well, I think I need to wrap up there because I'm at time, and I'm going to hand back to Bill to close us off. Bill?
Wow, that was fantastic. Really, really great, rich, deep discussion. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Hervé. And thank you, Todd, for an excellent job of walking us or helping us to navigate through a not so easy subject, particularly under the current situations that we're all dealing with and facing. But the real question is resilience and risk management and the importance of the sustainability function as it plays in that more business strategic role going forward. Before I make any final comments, I'd like everyone to think about this next Mentimeter question and respond if you can. This is a open-ended question to try to capture what you think sustainability will help you to better manage in both current and future economic downturns. Having just heard from 3 companies that have really put forward the strategic frameworks that have allowed them to better navigate in this COVID-related condition, perhaps you have some additional thoughts or ideas as to how you see your functional role changing. So while you think about that and respond, maybe a few reflective comments. All of the participant panelists today, Susan from Abbott Labs, Tim from Maple Leaf Foods, Hervé from BNP Paribas, talked about the sustainability strategy as integral to their business strategy. I think it was Susan that mentioned that they've linked the enterprise risk management structure of their business together with the materiality of the sustainability issues to put forward a robust business plan for dealing with situations like we're dealing with as we are today. From Maple Leaf, shared value is not CSR. Really an interesting and important statement. It is the business strategy to drive economic growth. Really, really interesting. And of course, BNP talking about selling time, but selling it in such a way as they're creating this race to the top that Hervé talked about at BNP. So quite fascinating. And how today the COVID crisis, as I think Todd referred to it as maybe one of these low probability but substantially high impact events, probably unprecedentedly high impact, and how were we prepared for that event in our business plans. It's kind of rewritten the book, if you will, on disruption and how it's, in some sense, helped us to think about how our operating and supply chains have to adapt and change in real time. A lot of it, let's face it, we were coming out of mid-March before things really started to become unraveled here in the US in particular, and how quickly some businesses had to adapt. I think the ones that were more prepared, like the ones we heard from today, were able to adapt and showcase the resilience of their business. I think it was Tim that mentioned resilience was built into our business plans. But now it's, all of the speakers talked about, and I think it was Susan's CEO who said, there's no going back to what was. But all of the panelists talked about how we have to reflect on what was in the current crisis and do a better job of thinking through these types of events going forward. But I think the capacity of the organizations to do that is actually quite likely at the moment. For those like Abbott and Maple Leaf, maybe it's going back. I don't mean to underplay the importance, but maybe it's going back and rethinking and tweaking a bit the plans you have at BNP as well. Whereas for some businesses, it's a complete rethink of the sustainability function into the business strategies for future events. Be interested to hear what others have to say about that in the comments that are popping up on the screen. Well, it's really close to our closing time. I really, again, want to thank Susan, Tim, Hervé, excellent job, really. And Todd, wonderful to have you, again, help us to navigate this really, really important subject today. Just to put a bit of a forward look on some things, there were some questions about how we enter into this new normal, or this new abnormal, as some may refer to it. The WBCSD has been working very closely with a number of member companies in developing return to work strategies under a case of scenarios that we're working with one of our members to help develop. So if you're interested in that work, you can refer to our website. It's under the COVID-19 response projects to maybe glean a little bit more information as to what some of the companies are thinking the return to work scenarios might do to their businesses. It's also about the employees, and Hervé talked about this in his closing comment about the nature of social interactions in the business place and how those will be an important factor for us to certainly take on. Please look forward. There'll be plenty of additional really great sessions in the landscape between now and July that WBCSD is hosting. We have a great slate of companies like the ones you've seen here today, but others that will reflect on different topics that are relevant to today's situation. Today's session itself will be captured and presented back to you in terms of a video that was recorded here, and the content will be available on the website as well. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to reflect on some of the answers that were popping up in the previous Mentimeter, but I guarantee there are some great responses in there, and we'll cultivate those and flag some of those in the report out that we'll give on the session. We're going to close a little bit early, maybe a couple of minutes. I would like to thank our facilitators in Geneva, who are helping us to maintain the technical aspects of this call. My colleague Miriam in New York, who was helping to keep me honest on time and time management. And again, our panelists from Abbott Labs, Susan Beverly, from Maple Leaf Foods, Tim Favory, and from BNP Paribas, Hervé Duquet. Just wonderful to have you with us today. And Todd, can't thank you enough. So with that, I'd like everyone to please, in their own way, applaud our panelists and thank them for our time and their time. It's a busy time for all of us. Please stay safe, stay sane, and stay healthy for the coming days, weeks, and hopefully no more than months of this current situation. Thank you, everyone, and we'll end the session now.